I had lived in that house for 25 years. Every nail, every plank held the warmth of my hands and the breath of my wife. But one day, a phone they forgot to hang up told me the truth, that I was no longer needed. In their plans, I was just an old man, ready to be packed away into a cozy facility. I listened in silence. That evening, they sold me along with the house while I was still sitting at the same table. But they forgot one thing. I was still alive, and my hands still remembered how to build and how to tear things down. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is George Miller. I was 72 years old, and I had built homes for other people my entire life. I knew how to lay a foundation that wouldn't shift, how to frame walls so they wouldn't crack in winter, how to build a roof that could hold under the weight of real Colorado snow. What I never learned was how to live in a house that no longer felt like mine. It happened on a Thursday evening, one of those spring nights when the wind still held a bite, but the garden smelled faintly of soil waking up. I'd just finished dinner, reheated meatloaf from earlier in the week, a habit I'd kept since my wife Ellen passed. I didn't cook anymore, not really. Just warmed things up and kept the portions small enough not to feel shame about wasting what I couldn't finish. I was sitting in Ellen's old recliner, the leather worn smooth on one armrest where she used to keep her hand while reading. The television murmured in the background, but I wasn't watching it. I just liked the company of the noise. The house had grown too quiet since she'd gone. The sounds that used to define our life, her footsteps, the clink of her teacup on the saucer, the soft turning of pages, had long since disappeared. Now, the only things that moved were the shadows, and me. That's when the phone rang. Not the cell phone I kept for emergencies, but the landline mounted on the kitchen wall. I still used it. Old habits, I guess. The screen lit up with my daughter's name, Caitlin. I smiled, stood up slowly, and walked toward it. The linoleum creaked beneath my steps, just like it always had. I picked up the receiver, cradled it between shoulder and ear, and greeted her like I always did. The conversation was brief, pleasant, rehearsed. She asked if I was eating well. I told her I was. She asked if I needed anything. I said no. She asked if I'd remembered to take my pills, and I said yes, even though I hadn't yet. It was all part of a familiar script. We said our goodbyes, and I gently placed the receiver back on the cradle. Only I didn't place it quite right. Something about the angle, or maybe the wear on the plastic, caused the connection to linger. The call didn't end. At first, I didn't notice. I rinsed my plate, wiped down the counter, and started toward the hallway when I heard voices, faint but clear. I turned back. The phone speaker was still live. They hadn't hung up. Caitlin's voice floated through, no longer performing, no longer softened by affection. Her tone had shifted into something sharper, something she thought I would never hear. I stood still. Not frozen, not afraid, just still. Like the moment before a beam is dropped into place and everyone on the crew goes quiet, holding their breath. Her words came clearly now. She was talking to Jeremy, her husband. They were still on the call, still speaking, assuming the conversation had ended. They were talking about me, not about visiting, not about taking me to lunch, not about spring flowers or how I was holding up. They were talking about moving me into a nursing home. Jeremy said it was time. Caitlin agreed. I was becoming a burden, she said. I'd nearly left the burner on the stove that week. What if I burned the house down? I hadn't. I'd caught it. I always caught it. But that didn't matter. Jeremy talked numbers. The house could sell for close to $1 million, maybe more with the market the way it was. Caitlin mentioned Boulder, that Mountain View property they'd looked at, the one with the big windows and open floor plan. He said this was the perfect opportunity. She laughed. That laugh stayed with me longer than anything else. Not cruel, not wicked, just indifferent, detached. The laugh of someone solving a problem. I stood there in the kitchen, fingers resting on the edge of the counter I had installed myself with sanded birch from a mill up north. My knuckles touched the very wood Ellen had once polished every Friday with lavender oil. The house around me had taken 25 years to build, one detail at a time. I'd done every inch of it myself, every doorknob, every hinge, every tile in the guest bathroom. My hands had touched them all. It was our project, our life. This house had heard our arguments, our laughter, our grief. It had held us steady through storms, both literal and otherwise. And now it was just equity in their mouths. Not once in that conversation did they say my name. Not once did they say the word Dad, or even George. I had become he, him, the issue, the situation. I didn't hang up. I didn't make a sound. I just stood there and listened, like a man in his own grave, hearing the words said over the dirt that would soon cover him. Eventually, the call ended. The line went dead. The kitchen was quiet again. I sat down in the chair by the phone and stared at the wall for a long time. I could feel my pulse in the tips of my fingers, not from anger, not from fear, from a calm that I hadn't known in years, the kind of calm you feel when the fog lifts and you finally see the road ahead. They thought I was slipping. They thought I was tired, confused, lonely. Maybe I was, but I wasn't weak. I had built my life with my own 2 hands. I had carried beams heavier than this betrayal. I had done the math and paid the bills and paved the driveway with my own sweat. I had put food on their table long before they ever sat at one together. And I still had one thing they didn't: time. Not in years. No, I had fewer of those left than most. But I had time in days, in hours. Time to make decisions. Time to think. Time to act. I stood up and walked back through the house, room by room, as if seeing it all again for the first time. The hall where Caitlin had taken her first steps. The stairs Ellen and I had painted 3 times before settling on eggshell. The dining room where birthdays had blurred together in candlelight and frosting. This house wasn't theirs to take, not while I was still here. I turned off the lights one by one, moved through the quiet, and stopped in front of Ellen's photo on the mantel. She looked at me like she always did, like she knew the ending before I did. My daughter thought the phone had gone silent. But it hadn't. And neither had I. I woke early the next morning, before the sun broke the edges of the sky. The house was still dark, still quiet, and I moved through it by memory. I didn't need light to know where the corners were, or where the floorboards gave the faintest creak beneath my heel. My body knew the rhythm of this place. It had known it for 25 years. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that I didn't particularly want, but made anyway out of habit. The coffee maker clicked and steamed like it always had. It was the same machine Ellen had insisted we buy back in 2007 because it brewed strong and fast. Now it sputtered slightly on the second cycle, but I didn't mind. There was comfort in things that refused to break, even when they had every excuse to. As the morning light stretched across the counter, I began to walk the house, not aimlessly, but with the measured steps of someone taking inventory. I needed to see it again, all of it, but not through the eyes of a homeowner. I had to look at it the way Caitlin and Jeremy did. I had to see it not as a life, but as an asset. I had to look at it the way someone looks at a house they plan to sell. So I walked, room by room. I started in the foyer. The front door was still the original oak I'd selected during the final stages of framing. Heavy, solid, reliable. I ran my hand along the paneling I had carved myself with a borrowed router. The grain was familiar. It had darkened with age, but held every cut, every groove. I remembered sanding it for hours in the garage with Ellen reading nearby, both of us excited about how it would feel to walk through a door that was truly ours. To a buyer, it was just an outdated entryway. To me, it was the first threshold we ever crossed together. In the hallway, I noticed the patch in the drywall where Caitlin had crashed her bicycle into the corner at age 8. I had repaired it the next day, with a bit of joint compound and paint that didn't quite match. The light still hit it differently, and I'd never bothered to repaint the entire wall. Every time I saw the mark, I smiled. It reminded me of scraped knees and the way Ellen scolded me for letting Caitlin ride indoors that day. To them, it would be a flaw, a visual blemish. To me, it was history. I moved into the living room, the heart of the house, with its wide windows and hand-finished trim. I'd installed crown molding one painstaking weekend, miscutting the first 3 angles before finally getting it right. The fireplace mantel was made of reclaimed wood from my first job site, sanded down until it gleamed like new. On cold mornings, I used to sit there with Ellen, both of us cradling mugs in our palms while the fire cracked. We'd built this room not just with lumber and nails, but with breath and patience. To them, it was square footage, a line item in a listing. In the dining room, the table was gone, but the indentations remained in the rug where the legs had stood. That table had held every Thanksgiving, every birthday, every time Caitlin had come home with news, good or bad. I'd sat at that table when Ellen told me her diagnosis, and I'd sat at that same table alone the day after the funeral. The walls knew all of it. To them, it was a selling point. Natural light, original hardwoods. I went upstairs. The master bedroom had barely changed. Ellen's pillow was still on her side of the bed. I hadn't had the heart to remove it. The closet still carried the soft trace of her perfume. Her dresses hung in neat rows, untouched, unjudged. I stood in that room longer than I meant to, feeling her presence like a folded blanket over my shoulders. But in a brochure, this room would become a primary suite with potential for renovation. Across the hall was Caitlin's old room. Yellow walls, now faded. A few stickers on the inside of the closet door, remnants of a childhood that seemed impossibly distant. The white desk I had built for her 16th birthday still stood under the window, scratched with years of schoolwork, nail polish, and notes written in erasable marker. I had watched her grow into herself in that room, arguing over curfews, celebrating college acceptances. I remembered standing at that doorway the day she moved out with her boxes taped shut, and her eyes bright with ambition. Now they saw it as a second bedroom, perfect for a nursery or guest room. I moved into the attic. I had installed the pull-down ladder myself, reinforced the joints, laid planks across the beams to store boxes evenly. Up there were decades of our lives. Christmas decorations in worn cartons, baby clothes Ellen had refused to part with, old photo albums she'd meant to digitize one day. The air was thick with dust and silence, and when I lifted one box lid and saw the tiny embroidered sweater Ellen had knit when Caitlin was born, something in me ached. But they wouldn't climb this ladder. They'd pay someone else to clean it out. They'd throw it all away. Back downstairs, I went to the kitchen. My fingerprints were in the grout between the tiles. I'd redone the backsplash after Ellen tore out a page from a magazine and said, "What do you think of this one?" The granite countertops had a fleck of gold in them that caught the light in the mornings. Ellen loved to stand there, barefoot, cradling her tea. Even after her treatments began, she still made it to the stove most mornings, insisting on keeping the rhythm as long as she could. Buyers wouldn't see any of that. They'd wonder if the appliances were stainless steel. They'd ask about the age of the HVAC unit. I opened the pantry. A jar of jam sat on the top shelf. Blueberry, her favorite. I hadn't touched it. Some things you just don't open. I walked to the garage. It smelled of wood and oil and thyme. My tools hung exactly where I left them. Every pegboard had a purpose. The workbench held scraps of unfinished projects, including a small picture frame I'd started making before Ellen's final trip to the hospital. I'd meant to finish it. I never did. They'd call this a 2-car garage with storage potential. I called it a cathedral of effort. I returned to the center of the house and stood in silence. I could hear the pipes contracting slightly, the heater clicking on. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a sound I knew by heart. I looked around at the rooms, the walls, the details no one else would notice. They'd see property, value, leverage. But I knew what they couldn't. This house was not just a structure. It was the skin of my life, and they had already reduced it to a price. In their voices, I heard spreadsheets and projections. They had turned every beam, every nail, every hour of sweat into a market decision. It wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure. They weren't selling a house. They were selling the last place that remembered who I really was. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, and the air carried that scent of damp concrete and old paper that always took me back to the first year we moved in. I had finished the space with my own hands, back when I believed in permanence. It was never fancy, just shelves, a work table, and rows of labeled boxes. But it was mine, my order, my logic, my quiet retreat. I called it the archive, half-jokingly. Ellen used to laugh and say, "Someday we'll need a map to find anything down there." But I knew where everything was. I always did. That morning, after walking the house, I went down with a purpose. The stairs creaked in a familiar rhythm under my feet. The light bulb above the landing flickered for a moment before giving in fully, its glow soft and yellow like a memory. I paused at the bottom step. It looked exactly as I'd left it, but something felt different, as if the boxes themselves knew they had become unnecessary. I began with the metal cabinet. On the top shelf were our tax returns, filed by year, going back to 1982. I pulled one folder at random. Inside were the marks of a life I once controlled: W-2s, property statements, itemized deductions. Each line was a thread in a net that once held us afloat. There was a time when I thought that being organized meant being prepared. That preparedness meant safety. That safety meant love. But all the receipts in the world hadn't prepared me for what was coming. I moved to the next box, medical records. Ellen's name printed in bold on dozens of manila envelopes. Doctor visits, test results, insurance battles. I remembered the months we spent reading those numbers, those charts, as if understanding them could stop what was happening to her body. I had highlighted passages, scribbled notes in the margins like a student desperate to pass a course no one could explain. And when she passed, I filed it all away, neatly, because that's what I did. That's who I was. Next to those were the home improvement files, manuals for the furnace, receipts for insulation, a folder labeled 2011 roof. Every penny accounted for, every step tracked. A lifetime of maintaining something we believed would shelter our daughter long after we were gone. That was the promise I made to Ellen, that Caitlin would never have to struggle for a roof, that this house would be her legacy. And now, they had reduced it to equity. I opened a smaller bin marked Caitlin School. Inside were every report card, every award certificate, a crumpled art project shaped like a bird that never quite balanced on its wire legs. I found the tuition statements from Stanford, the scholarship letter she'd cried over in the kitchen, the checks I wrote from the home equity line to cover what financial aid didn't. I had never told her the interest rate. I had never asked for anything back. Fatherhood, for me, was about the quiet assumption of debt. I pulled a leather folder from the bottom drawer. It was heavy, worn at the edges. Inside were the mortgage papers, the original deed, the refinancing documents. My signature appeared over and over again, loops and lines etched into obligation. I ran my fingers across the embossed notary seal, remembering the weight of the pen in my hand the day Ellen and I signed. We had toasted with lemonade on the back porch, thinking we were done with apartments forever. And now that same house was being marketed without me. I sat down on the old wooden stool beside the filing cabinet. My knees cracked as I lowered myself, and I winced. But it wasn't the pain that got to me. It was the echo. I had built this place with the idea that order protected us, that if I kept the ledgers full and the walls straight, love would hold. But love, it turned out, didn't care about ledgers. I reached into a banker's box I hadn't opened in years. At the top were letters from my mother, fragile paper, cursive loops fading. Below that, receipts from our first car, our second fridge, the hospital bill when Caitlin was born. I found an envelope with Ellen's handwriting that said, "For George, in case." I didn't open it. Not yet. It sat too heavy in my hand. I put it aside, gently, like something sacred. One folder held printouts of emails from when Caitlin studied abroad. I had saved every one. Her descriptions of Paris, her complaints about weather, her tentative joy. I read them slowly, as if the words might shift, offer me something I hadn't noticed before. But they didn't. They were bright, young, distant. In another box were the checks I had written over the past 10 years. Down payments, bailouts, gifts disguised as loans that were never intended to be repaid. I remembered each moment, the apologetic phone call, the urgent tone, the way I had always said yes. There were so many yeses, so many just this once. I had given not because I was wealthy, but because I believed it was my role. I believed it was what fathers did. Now I saw how those yeses had trained them to see me as endless, not human, not aging, not tired, just a vault with a weakening voice. I stood and paced the room, stopping at the corner where an old safe stood. I had kept it mostly for sentiment, though inside were a few bonds, a small emergency stash, and Ellen's jewelry box. I unlocked it, the code coming back to my fingers as if it had never left. Inside was the locket she wore every Sunday, her wedding band, and a brooch her grandmother had passed down. Caitlin had said she wanted them someday. But someday had become strategy. Inheritance had become an expectation. I closed the safe and sat back down. This basement held everything, every choice, every compromise. It was more than storage. It was proof. Proof that I had tried, that I had worked, that I had loved them in the way I knew how, through structure, through reliability, through a quiet and unshakable presence. But they hadn't wanted presence. They wanted product. I looked around the room again and realized what I had to do. This archive, this museum of me, it was no longer for them. It never should have been. If they had forgotten what was down here, that was their loss. If they thought me old and done and disposable, it was because they had never descended these stairs. They had never taken the time to see what I had saved. But someone else might. Someone who would understand that value is not just what you inherit. It's what you preserve and what you protect. I had not been inside a lawyer's office in over 2 decades. The last time was when Ellen and I updated our wills, choosing guardians for Caitlin in the event of a tragedy neither of us believed would ever happen. We left that meeting holding hands, solemn but reassured, as if merely signing those papers could keep death at bay. But things felt different now, colder, not because of the room's temperature, but because this time I walked in alone. The building was modest, red brick with worn shutters and a row of cracked concrete planters filled with dying ivy. A plaque near the door read, "Barnes and Keating, Estates Trusts, Real Property." The name hadn't changed in years. I remembered Barnes as a younger man, with rolled-up sleeves and a tie that never sat straight. Time had weathered both of us, but I wondered if he would remember me. The receptionist asked me to wait, and I lowered myself into a hard leather chair that creaked beneath my weight. I adjusted my posture, knees aching, back stiff. On the wall across from me hung framed photographs of past clients smiling next to their attorneys. Happy couples, successful transfers, safe hands. But there was no frame for men like me. No photo of the man who comes in when the world he built has already been quietly taken from him. The hallway to the back office was lined with carpet that muffled every footstep. I was offered a seat across from a desk that looked heavier than anything I could lift now. I placed a worn leather folder on the table and opened it carefully. Inside were copies of the original deed, the trust I had once drafted with Ellen, the tax evaluations, the appraised value documents. I had organized everything with the same precision I used when measuring the pitch of a roof or the depth of a foundation trench. Everything had to align. Every fact had to hold. When the attorney began reviewing the documents, I sat silently. I watched his eyes move from line to line, his fingers sliding each page just slightly forward, as if brushing off the dust of disbelief. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't afraid. I felt only a quiet, hollow certainty that this moment had been a long time coming. This wasn't about revenge. This was about order, about taking back what had been assumed lost. He asked a few questions. I nodded. Then he explained my options, not in legal jargon, but in firm, patient terms, as if he had done this for other men like me, men who had spent their lives believing that providing was enough. But he said nothing I hadn't already researched. I had read, highlighted, underlined. I had prepared. My name was still on every document that mattered. My authority remained intact. They had planned around my decline, but they had done so prematurely. I wasn't gone. I wasn't unaware. I was very much still present, and now I was ready. I instructed the lawyer to initiate a transfer, not of ownership, but of conditions. I would place the house into an irrevocable trust. The beneficiaries would change. The sale, if it proceeded, would require my approval. And any existing contracts made without my knowledge would be legally void. That alone caused the lawyer to sit back slightly, eyebrows raised. I didn't flinch. I simply tapped the paper again and told him to proceed. We discussed timelines, legal notices, quiet periods. My signature would need to appear on several documents. Witnesses would be arranged. We reviewed who would be informed, when, and how. There would be no drama, no headlines, just a firm reordering of what was already mine. The attorney asked if I wanted to pursue damages for misrepresentation. I shook my head. I wasn't looking to punish. I was looking to insulate myself from them, to build walls where once there had only been open doors. At one point, I pulled from my coat pocket a smaller envelope. Inside was a note I had written the night after hearing Caitlin's voice over the phone, after hearing her call me a burden, a problem to be solved. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was more like a statement, a boundary, a line in the sand. I placed it on the lawyer's desk and asked that it be held with my file, to be delivered under specific circumstances. He didn't read it, just nodded and slid it into a folder with the others. The last thing we reviewed was access, my accounts, my digital footprint, the documents required to revoke shared permissions, cancel third-party authorizations, remove linked bank access. We moved methodically. My hands, though slower, remembered every signature. I initialed, signed, dated. The lawyer affixed seals where needed. The sound of each stamp was like a quiet hammer against the old foundation I was reinforcing. When the paperwork was done, I sat still for a moment, staring at the folders now filled with my decisions. It felt like placing bricks into a wall I should have built long ago, not to keep people out, but to protect what little still belonged to me, my dignity, my space, my voice. The lawyer stood and thanked me for coming in. I thanked him for listening. As I walked out, the receptionist smiled politely. I returned it out of habit, but my mind was elsewhere. Outside, the sky was gray, but dry. I walked to my car slowly, my feet steady on the pavement. As I opened the door, I paused to look back at the building. It stood there like a sentinel, old but solid, like me. Driving home, I didn't turn on the radio. I needed the silence. I needed to hear my own breathing, to count the miles like measured steps toward something final. I had done what I came to do. The rest would follow. They thought they were moving pieces on a board, strategizing a future without me in it. But I had just reclaimed the board. And they didn't even know yet that the rules had changed. I had built homes from the ground up, poured the foundation with my own hands, carried drywall until my back screamed and my knees ached. I knew what it meant to sweat through a summer in Tennessee, to bleed onto lumber, to inhale dust until it settled in my bones. I was never the kind of man who needed reminders of effort. My body carried the record. The cracks in my knuckles, the scar along my shin, the ache in my shoulders that never fully faded even on quiet mornings. Those were my trophies. But the one thing I never learned, not fully, not in a way that mattered when it should have, was how to price myself. Not just my time, my worth, the real cost of labor. I remembered sitting at the edge of my bed, receipts fanned out like playing cards, old tax returns, bank statements, notes from subcontractors, photocopies of blueprints where my initials lingered in every corner. I didn't keep these for pride. I kept them because they were the only proof that I had once mattered. That somewhere in some county ledger or homeowner's file cabinet, I existed beyond just Dad, or the old man who doesn't drive anymore. Every beam I lifted had a cost. Every roof I patched in the rain had a toll. Every paycheck I split between a mortgage and ballet lessons, between broken appliances and birthday gifts, had been a quiet decision. Them first. Always them. And now, sitting with those papers under yellowed lamplight, I realized none of that sacrifice had been recorded in their memory. Not in Caitlin's voice when she forgot to hang up the phone. Not in her husband's smirk when they talked about the house, like it was some burdensome shell to be shed. Not in the real estate listing I'd found online, describing charming potential, in a home where Ellen once cried with joy after painting the nursery. They didn't know the value of the nails I drove into those walls, the hours I spent fixing the heater so Caitlin wouldn't be cold that winter when the storm knocked out half the grid. They didn't calculate the overtime I took just to afford her college applications, all invisible, all assumed. The labor of love is often unpaid, but more cruel than that, it's often forgotten. That week, I went to the storage unit I hadn't visited in years. The gate code still worked. The dust still settled the same way on the concrete floor. I opened Unit 417 and was hit with the smell of oil, aged cardboard, rust, and memory. Inside were the remnants of my life's work. Tools I could no longer hold with strength. Spare parts for machines long sold or given away. Trophies from a past no one cared to ask about. I didn't come to retrieve anything. I came to measure. Every item in that unit had a price tag once, a receipt, a sacrifice. I remembered hiding the cost of a new drill from Ellen by saying it was a gift from a vendor. I remembered skipping lunch for 2 weeks to afford a better set of levels. None of it glamorous, none of it story-worthy, but all of it mine. And yet, the people I loved the most had assigned me a value I hadn't chosen. They priced me at inconvenience, at embarrassment, at being too much to handle. A man to be relocated, managed, boxed away like the very tools I had once used to build their lives. I left the storage unit with nothing in my hands, but with a decision settled in my chest. I would not be appraised by those who only saw my slow steps, who mistook silence for submission. I would not be packaged into a narrative of decline while the echoes of my labor still sang in every corner of that house. The next morning, I opened a spreadsheet. It took time. My eyes weren't what they used to be, and my fingers, though steady, had a stiffness that annoyed me more than I'd admit. But I listed every home I built, every major project I completed. I tracked the years, the contracts, the bonuses, the missed anniversaries. I built my own record, one no one could erase or ignore. I totaled the sum, not just in dollars, but in time, in cost to the body, to the soul. And then, beneath that total, I typed a single sentence. And still, he was considered a burden. I printed the document and placed it beside the folder of legal forms from the lawyer's office. I wasn't planning to hand it to Caitlin or her husband. This wasn't for them. This was for me. To see plainly, in black ink on white paper, that I had given enough. Later that day, I received an email alert. The house was listed under pending sale. A buyer had submitted an offer. A closing date was being discussed. And yet, no one called to ask if I needed help packing. No one mentioned where I'd be going. It was then that I understood what they had truly done. They had not just put a price on a home. They had priced my entire life and decided it was worth less than convenience. But they had made a mistake, because the man who built homes also knew how to protect one. And just like I reinforced beams with steel before a hurricane, I had now reinforced my world with legal stone. No sale would go through. No key would turn. They had priced me wrong. The cost of labor is not just in the doing, it's in the remembering. And I had remembered everything. It didn't happen in a dramatic way. No thunderclap, no flash of lightning across the window, no angry phone calls or raised voices. It was quiet, almost too quiet for something so permanent, so irreversible. But that's how change often arrives for men like me, in stillness, with a pen in hand and a name scrawled at the bottom of a page. The lawyer's office was beige, not the soft, warm kind of beige that welcomes you in, but the dull, bureaucratic sort that lets you know this isn't a place for comfort. This was a place for decisions. I sat in the corner chair, the one without arms, because I hated the feeling of being boxed in. The clock on the wall ticked 1 second behind real time. I noticed that immediately. I always had a good sense for what was off, what didn't quite line up. In construction, that instinct had saved me from injury more than once. Now it told me the world was moving just slightly ahead of where I sat, and I had to catch up. Before me lay the papers, not many, just enough to feel heavy, the kind of weight that doesn't come from the thickness of the stack, but from what it carries. They were clean, professional, filled with language I didn't fully understand, but had studied for hours the night before. Words like revocation, transfer of rights, irrevocable trust. I wasn't used to these kinds of tools. My tools were physical, sharp-edged, and straightforward. But I knew power when I saw it. These papers were power. I had read every line 3 times, not because I doubted the lawyer. He had been kind, methodical, and patient with me, but because I needed to own what I was about to do. I needed to understand it fully, to stand behind it, not like a man who had been pushed into something, but like a man who chose it. This wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. The pen was smooth in my hand. He had offered me a nicer one, a fountain pen with gold trim, but I declined. I wanted to use the cheap black ballpoint I'd carried in my coat pocket for years. It had written grocery lists and reminders to buy light bulbs. It had signed Christmas cards and thank you notes. It had circled newspaper articles and made check marks on Caitlin's old report cards. It wasn't special, but it was mine. And it had one more job to do. I signed, just like that. The letters of my name curled slowly, deliberately, not shaky, though my hands had begun to tremble lately, especially in the cold. But that day, they were steady. My signature hadn't changed in decades. It was the only part of me that hadn't aged, not visibly. George Miller in firm strokes. The G always too wide. The M like a half-collapsed tent. But it was there, unmistakably mine. And when the final curve of the R swept into silence, I felt it. Something inside me shifted. All these years, I had been a man who built for others, who gave away pieces of himself, one job at a time, one sacrifice at a time, who stepped back so others could step forward, who believed that legacy meant letting them have more, while you accepted less. I had mistaken love for surrender. I had confused loyalty with obedience. But that signature, it was the opposite of all that. It wasn't loud. It wasn't vengeful. It was quiet ownership of a truth I had ignored, that my life, my work, my home, and my memory mattered. That I was not a relic to be archived or an object to be relocated. That I still had a voice, even if I didn't raise it. The lawyer nodded, confirming everything was in order. He offered to make copies. I said yes. I would keep one in my filing cabinet, another in my safe deposit box. A third I would place in the drawer by the bed, under my watch and wallet. Not for Caitlin, not for her husband, but for myself. To remind me, every time I opened that drawer, that I had not disappeared, that I had acted. Later, when I walked out of the office, the air felt heavier than it had when I entered. The clouds hung low, uncertain whether to release rain or let the day pass dry. I stood on the curb for a long while, not because I was tired, but because I was adjusting. Adjusting to the man I had just become, or perhaps the man I had always been, but never fully acknowledged. I thought about the house, the way Caitlin used to run down the stairs two at a time, the way Ellen arranged the books on the shelf by color, the crack in the third floorboard near the kitchen, where I dropped a socket wrench in '88 and never bothered to fix it because the sound it made underfoot made me smile. The backyard swing set, rusted now, but once a cathedral of childhood laughter. They had called it just a property. They had measured it in square footage and appraised it by market trends. But I had lived it. I had built it not with concrete and wood, but with long mornings, late nights, and the kind of love that never asks for credit. Now, it was no longer in their hands. The signature had changed everything. Not just the deed, not just the sale, but the balance of dignity. They would never know the moment it happened. They would never suspect it until the day came when their assumptions shattered against the reality they could no longer control. Until the day they turned their key in a lock that had forgotten them. And I would be elsewhere, watching, remembering, and no longer silent. I had never thought much about locks before. They were just things you installed because you had to, like smoke detectors or house numbers. Back when I worked in construction, I'd installed deadbolts and latch mechanisms with muscle memory, not philosophy. A lock was a tool to keep something out, or someone in. But that month, they became symbols, not just of protection, but of separation, of choice, of control. And after I signed the final paper, locks became the first thing I changed. The hardware store still had the same dusty ceiling fans spinning overhead, the same sleepy jazz playing from a radio that was older than half the staff. I parked far from the entrance out of habit, even though there were spots near the front. I had always walked a little extra, telling myself it was for my heart, even when I didn't believe it. I moved down the aisles like I knew them, and I did. Section 12 for exterior hardware, brass, steel, brushed nickel. I ran my fingers over the packages like I was reading Braille. I chose the heaviest deadbolt they had, the kind with a high security rating and reinforced plates. Not because I feared someone breaking in, but because I wanted the silence of its click to sound final. I wanted to hear it slide into place and know I had reclaimed something. I added a smart keypad lock, too. I knew how those things worked. Simple setup, temporary codes. I wouldn't need to explain anything to anyone. The code could change as often as I wanted, Control, not fear, not paranoia, just boundaries, something I hadn't had in a long time. Back home, I laid out the tools on the porch: screwdriver, drill, level. The wood had weathered some since the last time I replaced the door frame, but it held strong, like I had. That house had been built with patience and sweat, and the front door had been opened thousands of times, to kids with muddy shoes, to neighbors borrowing sugar, to my wife when she came back from church smelling like rain and lavender. Now, it opened only to me. I removed the old lock slowly. It resisted at first, screws stripped from years of use. It reminded me of how old habits cling, how they don't let go easily, even when you know it's time. But one by one, I pried them free. Each turn of the screwdriver felt like loosening the grip of a past that no longer served me. I set the old lock aside on a towel, not to be reused, not to be remembered. Installing the new lock was faster than I expected. The pieces clicked into place with almost arrogant ease. The final twist of the deadbolt echoed in the quiet house like a verdict. Then I programmed the keypad. 4 numbers. Not my birthday, not Caitlin's, not anything they'd guess. Just numbers that meant something only to me. That night, I slept without double-checking the door. For the first time in months, I didn't wake up at every sound. But locks weren't the end of it. There was the envelope. I had purchased it weeks earlier when the idea first started to take form. Not just any envelope, but a heavy linen one, the kind used for wedding invitations or legal notices. It had weight. It mattered how it felt in your hand. You couldn't crumple it and toss it aside. It insisted on being read. Inside, I placed a single piece of paper, handwritten, not typed. I wanted them to see my script, to recognize my hand, to know it was mine, and not some cold legalese. I had rewritten the note 4 times, tossing earlier versions into the fireplace like old drafts of a confession. The final version was brief. No explanations, no accusations, no pleas. Just a fact, and a signature. A fact they would not be able to undo. I sealed the envelope without licking it. I used a wax seal instead. The same brass stamp I had used to mark Christmas cards with Ellen. It bore the initial M. At the time, it had been decorative. Now, it was declarative. I kept that envelope in a drawer in the hallway table under a stack of irrelevant papers. Water bills, grocery lists, coupons I'd never use. I didn't want to see it every day. Didn't want it to mock me. But I needed it there. Ready. Not to be mailed. Not to be read by me again. But to be placed somewhere else when the time came. When the door would no longer open to the key they once held. The house felt different after the locks were changed. Not colder. Not lonelier. Just mine. The kitchen, with its humming fridge and crooked cabinet hinge. The hallway with the scuff marks I never painted over. The bathroom mirror, slightly foggy at the edges, where I still saw the man I had once been. It was a quiet kingdom, and I was the only one with the right to rule it. I stopped answering their texts after that, not out of spite, but clarity. There was nothing left to explain. They had made their choices with careless certainty. They had whispered their plans through a phone they thought was muted, as if their words didn't travel, as if I wasn't listening. But I had heard them. Every word. And now they would have to listen to silence. The envelope waited. It was patient, like me. And soon, when they would return, key in hand, smiles rehearsed, expectations loaded, it would greet them on the doorstep, placed with care, aligned perfectly, as if welcoming them home. But the home would not recognize them anymore, and neither would I. I had always believed that downsizing was something people did when they had no choice left, a necessity, a reluctant nod to shrinking incomes, failing health, or the quiet pressure of a world that no longer had space for them. But when I handed over the last key to the life I once built, I didn't feel smaller. I felt compressed, maybe, but not diminished. More like a ship drawn into harbor. Still the same structure, just closer to the dock. The apartment I found was in an older part of town, a neighborhood that hadn't yet been gentrified into something glossy and unbearable. The sidewalks were cracked, the streetlights hummed, and the people kept to themselves unless you needed jumper cables or a cup of sugar. I liked that. The building had 3 stories, faded red brick, and a creaky elevator I refused to use. Climbing the stairs felt like a ritual, a reminder that I still had a say in where my feet took me. Unit 2B had a small brass plate on the door. The hallway outside smelled faintly of onions and bleach. Inside, the space was barely larger than the master bedroom I used to have. 1 window, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with cabinets that groaned when opened, and a refrigerator that whined at night like a child dreaming of storms. But it was mine, entirely. No shared mortgage, no shadowed corners where someone else's shoes might reappear, no hushed voices down the hall plotting convenience over kinship. The first few days, I barely unpacked. I slept on a mattress on the floor with my jacket rolled up under my head. The boxes sat untouched, stacked like tombstones of a life now paused. I kept the curtains closed and let the dust settle on the windowsill. I needed time, not to mourn, but to unlearn. Eventually, I found rhythm. Mornings started early, with sunlight sneaking through the thin fabric of the blinds. I made coffee on the stovetop and sat by the window with a chipped mug I had brought from the old house. I liked the silence. It didn't feel empty. It felt earned, like silence that had waited its turn. My knees protested the narrow shower stall, and the tiles were cold, but I learned the exact angle to wedge the water just right. I began keeping things simple. 1 set of dishes, 2 towels, a broom instead of a vacuum. I donated most of my furniture, not out of principle, but because the rooms couldn't hold them. The apartment trained me in restraint. I began to understand that abundance had once weighed me down. This place made me light. I found a small second-hand desk and placed it by the window. On it, I kept a notebook and a pen. Some days I wrote. Not full sentences, just fragments. Things I remembered. The sound of my wife's laugh when she forgot herself. The way Caitlin used to hold my hand with her whole palm when she was 5. The scratch of sawdust under my boots after a long day's work. I didn't write to revisit. I wrote to release. There was a park 2 blocks away, a modest patch of grass with a crooked bench and a drinking fountain that never quite worked. I walked there in the afternoons, watching people pass. Nobody knew who I was. Nobody cared. I liked it that way. There was a strange freedom in anonymity. I could be anyone, or no one at all. Once I saw a little girl trying to fly a plastic bag like a kite. Her mother sat nearby, scrolling through her phone. The girl laughed when the bag caught a gust and lifted for half a second. I smiled. I hadn't smiled in days. It felt strange, like using a muscle I hadn't needed in a while. Nights were the hardest, not because I was lonely, but because quiet has a way of peeling back the layers you've built to survive. I'd lie on my bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the faint thuds of footsteps from the apartment above. I wasn't afraid of the silence. I welcomed it. But inside it, my mind wandered. I thought about what they might be doing back at the old house, whether they repainted the walls, whether they laughed in the kitchen, whether they still thought of me at all. I reminded myself that it didn't matter. They had made their choice, and so had I. I kept the envelope with me. Not the original, I had left that one behind, but a copy, a reminder. I tucked it in the drawer next to my bed, beside the flashlight and the spare glasses. I didn't look at it often, but I knew it was there, like a lighthouse in reverse, not a guide home, but a warning not to return. Some evenings I would boil rice and heat up canned vegetables. I found comfort in the small rituals of living. The click of the burner, the scrape of the spoon against the pot. I used to think life had to be big to be meaningful. Now I knew better. Life just had to be honest. The small apartment never felt like a cage. It felt like a clearing, a space between chapters, a place where breath came easier and the weight of other people's expectations dissolved at the threshold. I began sleeping better. I no longer woke in fear of footsteps or muttered plans behind closed doors. My rest was undisturbed, and for the first time in years, I woke up without dread. I did not decorate much, just one photo by the bed, a black and white one of my wife, younger than I ever knew her, and a plant on the windowsill that I sometimes forgot to water. It clung to life anyway, maybe because I did too. The small apartment did not ask for explanations. It didn't demand apologies. It let me be, and in that letting, something inside me softened. Not forgiveness, but peace. Money had always been a tool in my life, useful, necessary, and often invisible in its workings. I earned it through honest labor, watching it pass through my hands into mortgages, groceries, and the occasional rare indulgence. But never had I considered it armor. Not until I stood outside a cold office with a manila folder under my arm and a signature that meant I was no longer unprotected. The decision to move the funds had not come swiftly. It had brewed quietly, in the spaces between sleep and silence, in the loneliness of my new apartment, and the echo of a phone call never meant for my ears. My daughter's voice still haunted me, not the words themselves, but the certainty in them, the convenience with which she laid plans for a future that didn't include me. It was not malice, it was entitlement, the kind that slips into a house unnoticed and settles into the cushions. I knew what they believed, that age weakens not just the body, but the mind, that I would not notice things like forms placed in front of me too casually, like the casual mention of selling the house, like the polite rush to get me into a facility that could meet my needs. But I noticed everything, every softened phrase, every smile a beat too wide, every paper that arrived unrequested. And so, I began to act. The first step was the transfer. The money from the house had landed in a joint trust, or so they assumed. But a trust, like any structure, is only as fixed as its foundations. I had built mine on clauses and backups, written in the kind of language only time and pain could craft. I went back to the attorney, the one who had handled the papers after my wife passed, and I asked questions I hadn't needed answers to before. Quietly, without announcement, I began to redraw the map of what was mine. The apartment became my sanctuary, but the money became my gate. I rewrote it into protected accounts, created layers between it and those who once called me a burden. I didn't need the wealth. I needed the freedom it bought. Not yachts or vacations, just distance, just options. I bought a safety deposit box. In it, I placed not just cash, but evidence. Photos, notarized letters, duplicate keys, and the full record of the home sale, signed by me, tracked by wire. I made copies of everything. One set in the bank, one set mailed to a P.O. box in a neighboring county. Redundancy was not paranoia. It was strategy. Some nights, I would sit at my desk with the financial statements laid out like maps before me. I traced the paths from one account to another, marking dates, verifying balances. It was not about greed. It was about not being erased, not being shuffled aside as though my years of work, love, and sacrifice could be converted into a line item on someone else's ledger. The lawyer helped me set up a foundation, not a grand one, just enough to make the assets less accessible to anyone but me. I didn't name it after myself. I didn't even tell anyone it existed. But through it, I ensured that what was mine would not slip away through signature or sentiment. It would remain mine until I said otherwise. I began receiving mail again, not from my daughter or her husband, but from banks, records offices, insurance agents. Each envelope was a brick in the wall I was quietly building. I no longer dreaded the sound of the mail slot. I welcomed it. I remembered how often I had been told that family meant trust, that we give without condition, because we love. But I had learned something else. Love without boundaries becomes a weapon in the wrong hands, and trust is not something granted by blood, but by action. In the midst of these quiet maneuvers, I made time for simple joys. A walk in the morning, a cup of coffee by the window. The life I was building did not need to be large. It needed to be mine. The money did not define me, but it gave me the silence to define myself. Sometimes I imagined what would happen if they found out, if they tried to reverse what had been done. But I had prepared for that too. I had letters drafted, accounts frozen behind passwords and contingencies. I had traced every line of my life back to the beginning and marked it for myself. If they came, they would find not an old man in a chair, but a fortress made of numbers, dates, and decisions. I wasn't hiding. I was choosing. And every dollar, every transfer, every paper signed was a decision not to be erased. I thought about my wife more often now. She had always handled the budget. I remembered the way she used to press her lips together while calculating bills at the kitchen table. She would be proud of this, I think. Not the money, but the resolve, the care, the refusal to be diminished by the very people who owed their lives to our labor. I didn't see myself as clever, just awake. Finally. The accounts were modest compared to some, but they were mine, untouched, untouchable. And in a world that often renders the elderly invisible, that fact alone was a kind of power. I did not want revenge. I wanted protection. And now I had it. They returned on a Tuesday, just after noon. I knew because I had checked the flight schedule 3 times the day before, tracking the layover and arrival time with the same precision I once applied to engineering blueprints. They flew in from Phoenix, still bronzed from their business trip, or perhaps their vacation, though I had stopped trying to distinguish the two. To them, time away had become a blur of convenience and opportunity. I had become the inconvenience. I remained in the same small apartment I had quietly rented months before. The walls were still blank, not because I lacked taste, but because I had learned to appreciate impermanence. I had no desire to recreate the past. I only needed it to breathe. The kettle hissed on the stove. The windows were open to let in the early autumn air, and I could almost hear the first crunch of their tires rolling into the driveway I no longer owned. The house, my house, stood exactly where it always had, wrapped in weathered brick and soft shadows, but it no longer answered to them, not legally, not structurally. They had sold it to a faceless buyer, grinning at the sum, not realizing that they had never owned it in the first place, at least not in the way they thought. Their names were never on the original deed, only added later through polite persuasion and a well-rehearsed script. But paper tells the truth, and my lawyer and I had prepared the truth long before they understood they'd need it. As they stood on the porch that afternoon, I imagined the moment the key refused to turn. That small metallic betrayal, the fumbling, the disbelief, the shift from amusement to concern. I pictured the way their bodies leaned in, inspecting the lock like amateurs, tapping the handle, rattling it as if confusion were a tool. But the locks had changed, not recently, long before the sale. The buyer they thought they'd signed with had never existed, at least not outside of a chain of holding companies that circled back to a single quiet account in my name. A closed circle, like a completed loop of wire, humming silently with intention. They never noticed the new mailbox. The brushed steel plate didn't match the old brass one. It wasn't decorative, it was precise. Inside, it rested an envelope, sealed neatly, addressed to them in my own handwriting. Not with anger, with finality. I didn't need to be there. I had already been there enough. Years of sweeping floors and sealing windows. Years of covering for late mortgage payments and plumbing repairs. Years of babysitting in the middle of winter while they boarded planes to places with names I no longer heard. I had done my part. And now I was done playing the part of the invisible benefactor. I had placed the note inside a plain manila envelope, but the contents were anything but ordinary. It contained copies of the original property transfer, showing the reversal I'd enacted months before. It included bank statements, notarized affidavits, and a quiet but thorough clause revoking any power of attorney they thought they held. I wrote no insults, no accusations, just facts, just paper. And at the bottom of the page, I wrote the sentence I had carried in my heart, ever since I overheard the phone call. You forgot I was listening, but I never stopped remembering. I imagined the scream, sharp, sudden, echoing across the empty porch, then muffled by disbelief. Perhaps they thought it was a prank. Perhaps they thought it could be undone. But I knew better. Once a truth is revealed, it cannot be folded back into silence. Back in my apartment, I poured myself a cup of tea. The quiet felt earned now. Not lonely, not bitter, just clean. I didn't need to witness their reaction. Their confusion was not my concern. I had already lived through their convenience, through their plans that left no room for the man who paid for their college, who built the roof they now stood beneath, confused by its new resistance. The inheritance they imagined was gone, not squandered, not stolen, but reoriented, protected, and still active, still generating interest, still capable of helping someone. Just not them. Not anymore. I had made arrangements with a veterans housing fund. The house would be donated in 6 months, transformed into transitional shelter. My daughter would never understand why. That was the point. Some legacies are meant to break patterns, not continue them. In their eyes, I was supposed to fade, to simplify their lives by shrinking mine, to move quietly into a facility where my final chapters could be managed and scheduled. But I had always been a builder, and builders do not vanish. They reinforce, they reframe, they reclaim. That day, while they stood speechless on the porch of a house no longer theirs, I sat at my desk, reviewing blueprints, not of buildings, but of the future. Mine. It was not lavish, but it was mine. I did not answer their calls. I did not return their messages. I had said all I needed to say in ink, notarized and mailed. Sometimes freedom comes not from escape, but from design. I hadn't run. I had redrawn the map, and they were no longer on it. I had written the letter 3 days before their flight landed. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't dramatic. It was methodical, deliberate, and as quiet as the rest of my decisions had become. The page sat folded on my desk for a full night before I sealed it in the envelope. The paper smelled faintly of cedar, pulled from the back of an old drawer in my apartment where I stored my spare stationery. There was nothing ornate about it, no bold colors or engraved initials, just a clean white sheet and black ink that carried the weight of everything I had withheld for far too long. I didn't write to plead or to explain. I didn't offer apologies or warnings. I wrote to end something, not my connection to them, that had already withered under the weight of their silence, but the fiction they'd been living in, the comfortable illusion where they saw themselves as heirs to something they never valued, managers of a life they never built, caretakers of a man they quietly plotted to remove. I imagined their faces as they reached the front door. The house would have looked the same at first, brick, pale trim, familiar shadows falling across the porch. But the lock would not respond. The air would feel different, colder maybe, not from temperature, but from the absence of welcome. The house had memory. I believed that. It remembered who loved it, who bled into its walls, who walked its halls at 3 a.m., checking the water heater or standing at the window during storms just to be sure the gutters held. It remembered me, not them, and taped neatly to the wooden panel between the doorbell and the house number, they would find the envelope. Their last invitation. Not to return, but to understand why they could not. The edges of the letter curled slightly in the breeze, but I had secured it well with clear tape, positioned perfectly so they couldn't miss it. It was the first thing their eyes would land on after the key failed to turn. The content was simple. 3 paragraphs. The first was acknowledgement. I had heard the call. The accidental truth spilled between a grocery list and a laugh. I had heard my daughter say the words she thought I'd never catch, words she never meant for me to hear, but said anyway, as though I were already gone. The phone hadn't clicked the way she thought, and I had heard every syllable. The second paragraph was legal. A brief summary of the actions I'd taken since, the reversal of the property title, the withdrawal of shared access to accounts, the removal of their names from every document that once bound us financially. I listed dates, not feelings. I cited witnesses, not emotions. The facts were the only things they couldn't argue with. They could scream, they could blame, they could panic, but they couldn't undo paper. Not this time. The third paragraph was the one I had rewritten 5 times, not because I struggled to find the words, but because I didn't want to waste a single one. I didn't want to come across as bitter. I wanted it to feel clean, a final line drawn with a ruler, not a sword. I told them I was safe, that I had no need for revenge, that the house would serve someone else now, that my silence wasn't a punishment, but a boundary made necessary by what they had chosen to become. I signed the letter with my full name, not Dad, not Father, just the name on my birth certificate, George H. Miller, because by then I knew that was the only part of me they had never been able to manipulate. I left no forwarding address. I changed my number. The only number they could still dial rang to a service that offered a polite recorded message informing callers that the line had been disconnected. That message, I imagined, said more than I ever could. Back in my apartment, I sat by the window with the newspaper folded open, but unread. My tea had gone cold, but I didn't mind. I wasn't waiting for news. I wasn't anticipating the fallout. I had already lived inside the worst part, the betrayal that came not from strangers, but from my own blood. The planning behind my back, the meetings with brokers, the laughter in the background of that call, the casual cruelty. Now there was no yelling, no confrontation, only the quiet response of paper, locks, and absence. The house would stand as it always had, but it no longer belonged to the story they had tried to write. It was no longer a trophy, no longer a fallback, no longer a name on their future plans. It had returned to what it always was, mine. And soon, it would belong to someone who needed it, someone whose name I did not know, but whose circumstances I understood. Someone with no place to go. Someone who, like me, knew what it was to be forgotten. They could read the letter as many times as they liked, memorize every phrase, analyze the handwriting, rage at the wording. None of it would change the truth. They had spoken of my removal as if I were a burden. They had planned to erase me with bureaucracy and nursing homes, but I had always believed in architecture, in structure, in the invisible strength of beams hidden behind walls, in the slow, steady process of holding weight until it could be released. I had not collapsed. I had not crumbled. I had reinforced. And the letter on the door, that was the final beam, not to hold anything up, but to keep them out. The morning they returned, I knew it before the phone buzzed, before the news trickled down from the lawyer's office, before anything reached me directly. It wasn't intuition. It was geometry. Everything they built had been resting on assumptions, and assumptions make poor scaffolding. I had simply removed a few invisible beams, and the rest had no choice but to fall. Their flight landed late the previous night. I had seen the itinerary months ago, left open on my daughter's kitchen counter one afternoon, when she forgot I could still read upside down. First class, red-eye, 3 cities in 10 days, with real estate meetings in 2 of them. My name wasn't mentioned, but my house was. My life was. They were planning not a return to family, but a return to profit. I wasn't a man anymore in their eyes. I was inventory. While they were away, my daughter had moved quickly with her lawyer, faster than even I expected. They had signatures ready. My signature, or so they thought. I imagined them smiling, confident that the documents were as good as sealed. My name, forged or coerced, was supposed to greenlight everything. But what they hadn't considered was that I had already moved first. Months earlier, I had made the appointment. A different lawyer. A quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses and an office that smelled of linen and dust. He didn't ask many questions after I showed him the tape. Just nodded, took notes, made copies, and prepared the papers I signed with a hand that no longer shook. The house title, the estate details, the will. All of it was redrawn, reordered, and repositioned. They had been playing with a script written on water, and I had etched mine in stone. So when they returned home, I wasn't there. And the house didn't open for them. They called me, first with irritation, then concern, and finally with panic, but the number they had didn't work anymore. The voicemail had been disabled. The email bounced. Their contacts, the ones who used to call me Dad or Mr. Miller, had been gently informed that I had relocated and was no longer available for communication. They tried the lawyer next. Not theirs, mine. His office took their call, placed them on hold, then transferred them to someone who had the unenviable task of explaining, in neutral language, that the house had already been sold, that the proceeds had been allocated, that the new owners had the keys, that the documents they had drafted had no legal standing, that the power of attorney they believed they held had been revoked weeks prior. I was told their voices went quiet on the other end of the line, not in sadness, in calculation, the kind that only appears when people realize their game has ended and the pieces no longer obey them. They drove to the house anyway, still hoping it was all a mistake. Maybe the lawyer was bluffing. Maybe the locks were faulty. Maybe I had left through the back door and was still somewhere inside. But the house met them like a stranger, cold, unblinking. The porch light flickered because it had been rewired. The curtains had changed. The car in the driveway belonged to someone else. They didn't knock. They just stood there. On the doorstep where I once stood after fixing their childhood bicycles, where I had leaned with scraped hands after painting the gutters, where I had greeted them with lemonade or blankets depending on the season. That threshold was no longer theirs. And taped to the door was the letter I had left. The one I'd written days before, anticipating this moment with the kind of clarity that comes only from betrayal. It wasn't just about protecting the property. It was about reclaiming the story. They had tried to rewrite mine without permission, and now they were seeing the revised ending for the first time. Back in my small apartment, I made tea and opened the window. The breeze was gentle, and the world had not changed. But I had. My space was quiet. My decisions mine. The apartment was smaller than the house, yes, but it fit me. It was the right size for one man, and the truth. The money from the sale sat untouched in a new account, not for revenge, not for grandeur, for safety, for solitude, for the simple act of saying, I exist, I endured, and I did not yield. I didn't watch the fallout. I didn't log in to see if they posted vague complaints on social media or scrambled to cover the embarrassment among friends. I didn't wait for a second call or another letter. The chapter was closed. I thought about the word collapse and how it was often used to describe sudden disasters, falling buildings, crumbling bridges. But the real collapses, the ones that last, happen slowly, not with fire or screams, but with silence and inevitability. Their plan collapsed not because I struck it down, but because they never considered that I still stood. And now they would learn what it felt like to stand outside something they thought they owned, reading words they never expected from a man they no longer understood.